Dr. Elena Vance faces a massive multi-vehicle pileup followed by a chemical leak and a total power failure. Amidst the chaos, she must protect her patients from both a toxic plume and a mercenary who has infiltrated the hospital in search of a mysterious briefcase. To save everyone and secure a vital heart transplant, Elena is forced to draw upon the strategic military past she had fought so hard to hide. It is a medical thriller about extreme resilience, where professional ethics collide with the raw instinct of survival in an urban warfare setting. The humidity in Chicago usually clings to the skin like a wet wool blanket, but inside the sterile, pressurized corridors of Cook County's premier-level wine trauma center, the air was unnervingly cold. Dr. Elena Vance adjusted the bridge of her glasses, the sharp scent of antiseptic and floor wax filling her lungs, a scent that, for her, had always been the smell of order. At 7:54 p.m., the ER was humming with the rhythmic, predictable chaos of a Friday night. A few broken ankles from a local league game, a minor respiratory distress in Bay 4, and the steady beep-beep-beep of monitors that served as the hospital's heartbeat. Elena looked at the digital clock on the wall, her reflection caught in the glass of the nurse's station. She looked younger than a chief resident should, a fact the senior surgical consultants never failed to mention, but her hands were steady as she updated a patient's vitals on the tablet. The shift was supposed to be a standard handoff. Her mentor, Dr. Eris Thorne, was already gathering his things, complaining about the Cubs' losing streak. Then, the red phone, the one that bypasses every switchboard, the one reserved for the kind of news that changes lives, began to scream. The ER charge nurse, a veteran named Marcus who had seen 3 decades of Chicago winters, froze mid-sentence. When Elena picked up the receiver, the voice on the other end was frantic, competing with the roar of sirens and the distorted crackle of a high-gain radio. The report was short, brutal, and impossible. A 40-car pileup on the I-90 involving 2 Greyhound buses and a fuel tanker. The caller didn't give a count. He gave a warning. Estimated 40-plus incoming. ETA 6 minutes. We are looking at multiple ejections and high-velocity impact trauma. Elena felt the air leave the room. 40 patients. In a single wave. That wasn't a busy night. That was a battlefield. She looked at Marcus, then at the clock. 6 minutes. The standard operating procedure, the SOP she had memorized until it was a prayer, dictated a graduated response. But Elena saw the math in her head. The limited trauma bays, the available ventilators, the exhaustion creeping into the night staff's eyes. She didn't look at Dr. Thorne for permission. She didn't wait for the incident command to be formally established by the administration upstairs. Activate a code black, Elena's voice rang out, cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. Now, I want every available surgeon, every respiratory therapist, and every off-duty nurse in this wing within 5 minutes. Clear the hallways. Move the green and yellow tags to the cafeteria annex immediately. Elena, wait. Thorne stepped forward, his brow furrowed. A code black is a total facility lockdown. We haven't even seen the first ambulance. If you call it too early, you paralyze the hospital. Start with a level orange. Elena didn't blink. She could already hear it. The distant building chorus of sirens wailing from the expressway, a sound that felt like an approaching storm. We don't have time for a level orange, Dr. Thorne. With 40 victims, we are already underwater. I am calling Triage Level Red for the entire ER floor. We are skipping the intake desk. We go straight to stabilization. The hospital transformed in an instant. The flickering fluorescent lights seemed to sharpen as the overhead speakers crackled to life, announcing the code black. The metallic thud, thud, thud of the heavy security doors locking down echoed through the corridors. Marcus was already barked orders, his voice a gravelly anchor in the rising tide. The smell of the ER changed. The sterile scent was replaced by the ozone of the backup generators kicking in, and the frantic metallic heat of a team moving at a dead run. Elena stood at the center of the trauma bay, her yellow lead vest heavy on her shoulders. She felt the vibration in the floor before she saw the lights. The first 5 ambulances were screaming into the bay, their tires screeching against the concrete. The glass doors slid open, and the heat of the Chicago night rushed in, carrying the smell of burnt rubber, spilled diesel, and the iron tang of fresh blood. The first gurney burst through, a paramedic leaning over a young man, performing rhythmic, desperate chest compressions. 20-year-old male, unrestrained driver, blunt force chest trauma, lost pulse 2 minutes out, the paramedic shouted over the din. Elena stepped into the path of the gurney, her eyes scanning the patient in a 3-second triage level red assessment. She saw the tracheal deviation, the cyanosis around the lips. BA1, tension pneumothorax. I need a chest tube now, she commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Behind that gurney came another, and another. A woman clutching a blood-soaked teddy bear, screaming for a daughter who wasn't there. An elderly man with a compound fracture that made the seasoned interns turn away. The ER, once an organized sanctuary of healing, was becoming a labyrinth of groans, shouting, and the rhythmic shh-pock of manual resuscitators. Elena was a conductor in a symphony of crisis, her mind operating on a level of pure, cold logic that bypassed fear. She moved from patient to patient, her hands moving with surgical precision, her decisions final and absolute. "Dr. Vance!" Marcus shouted, pointing toward the doors. 7 more ambulances were backing into the loading zone, their red and blue lights strobing against the glass like a fever dream. The count was climbing. The oxygen pressure in the main lines was beginning to dip as more ventilators were pulled from storage. The hospital was a fortress under siege, and the walls were starting to sweat. Elena looked at the clock again. It had only been 12 minutes since the phone rang. She saw a glimpse of her own hand as she reached for a fresh pair of gloves. It was shaking, just a fraction. She clamped it shut, forcing the tremor into a fist. She couldn't afford a tremor. Not tonight. Not when the I-90 had just emptied its broken contents onto her doorstep. She looked at the sea of red tags, the most critical of the critical, and realized the 40 patients they were promised were just the first wave of a much larger collapse. As the doors swung open for the 10th time, bringing in a stench of smoke that suggested the fuel tanker had finally ignited, the power overhead flickered once, twice, and then plunged the entire trauma center into a terrifying, suffocating darkness. The backup lights struggled to hum to life, casting long, ghostly shadows over the screaming patients. The darkness lasted only 4 seconds, but in a level-1 trauma center, 4 seconds is an eternity. When the emergency red lights finally flickered to life, they bathed the ER in a haunting crimson glow. The rhythmic hum of the high-performance HVAC system had died, replaced by the strained mechanical whine of the backup generators. The air grew heavy and stagnant almost instantly. Elena stood in the center of the bay, the red light reflecting off her face shield, making her look like a phantom in a war zone. The screaming hadn't stopped, but it had changed pitch. A raw, primal edge of panic now underlined the physical agony of the wounded. "Nobody moves unless you have a hand on a patient." Elena's voice projected with a forced calm that masked the knot tightening in her chest. "Marcus, I need a status report on the ventilators. If the main grid is down, the compressors might lag." "We're on Tier 2 power, Doc," Marcus shouted back, his forehead glistening with sweat that looked like dark oil under the red lights. "The ICU is screaming for priority, and the OR just lost their primary scrub light array. They're working on battery backups up there." The smell of the room was shifting. The metallic tang of blood was now mixing with the faint, acrid scent of ozone and the heavy, humid heat rolling in from the open ambulance bay doors. Without the full power of the hospital's filtration system, the stench of the crash site, diesel, burnt upholstery, and the wet earth of the Chicago median began to settle over the trauma bays. It was a sensory assault, a reminder that the world outside was in chaos, and the walls of the hospital were no longer a total shield. Elena moved toward Bay 3, where a junior resident was struggling with a portable suction unit that wasn't drawing enough power. The patient, a woman in her 30s with a crushed pelvis and a rapidly expanding hematoma, was choking on her own emesis. "Step aside," Elena commanded, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brooked no delay. She didn't wait for the machine. She grabbed a manual bulb syringe, cleared the airway with 3 sharp movements, and felt the patient's chest rise in a ragged, desperate gasp. "Vitals? BP is 80/40 and dropping. HR is 140. The resident stammered, his eyes wide behind his goggles. I can't find the secondary IV site. The veins are collapsing. Central line. Now. Don't go for the peripheral," Elena said, her hands already prepping the patient's neck. "In a code black, we don't fish for veins. We take the highway." As she guided the needle into the internal jugular, a task she could do in her sleep, but which felt treacherous in the shifting red shadows, she heard a heavy thud from the hallway. A gurney had collided with a supply cart in the dim light. Supplies, bandages, saline bags, sterile kits, scattered across the floor like discarded bones. The pressure was mounting. The humiliation of the situation was starting to set in. A world-class facility was being reduced to frontier medicine because of a grid failure and a sheer volume of bodies that defied the SOP. "Dr. Vance!" a voice boomed. It was the hospital administrator, Mr. Sterling, appearing at the edge of the trauma zone. He looked absurd in his bespoke suit, his face pale as he took in the carnage. "What is happening? Why is the entire hospital in lockdown? I have board members calling me about canceled elective surgeries. This is a PR nightmare." Elena didn't look up from the central line. She clicked the catheter into place and began the rapid infusion of O-negative blood. Mr. Sterling, unless you have a medical degree or a gallon of O-neg in your pockets, you are an obstruction. We have 42 patients on the floor, 12 in Triage Red, and the I-90 is currently a graveyard. The grid is out across the south side. This isn't a PR nightmare, it's a survival event. You don't have the authority to maintain a code black without a committee review, Sterling hissed, stepping closer, his presence a jarring contrast to the life and death struggle around him. The loss of revenue from the surgical suites alone— Marcus, Elena interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous low vibrato. Escort Mr. Sterling to the incident command room. If he leaves it before I say so, tell security he's interfering with emergency protocols. The administrator gasped, but Marcus was already there, his massive frame looming over the smaller man. This way, sir. Now. The distraction lasted only a moment, but the cost of the pressure was visible everywhere. Elena saw her team flagging. The initial adrenaline spike was wearing off, replaced by the crushing weight of the mass casualty reality. They were out of trauma bays. Patients were being treated on gurneys in the hallways under the flickering red emergency lamps. The sound of a portable monitor flatlining, the dreaded code blue tone, echoed from the back of the ER. Who is that? Elena yelled, spinning around. Bay 7! The driver of the bus! A nurse cried out. Elena ran. She didn't walk. She sprinted, dodging a pile of discarded bloody gauze and a sobbing relative who had somehow breached the perimeter. In Bay 7, she found Dr. E. Thorne, her mentor, looking uncharacteristically haggard. He was holding a manual defibrillator, his hands slick with sweat. He's in V-fib, Elena, Thorne said, his voice strained. But the charge is taking too long. The capacitor isn't drawing enough from the emergency circuit. Sync it to the portable battery pack, Elena ordered, grabbing the cables. That's not in the manual, Vance. If it surges, you'll fry the board and the patient. The manual was written for a building with lights on, Eris. Clear. She slammed the paddles down. The patient's body jolted, a violent arc against the thin mattress. The monitor remained a flat, mocking line. The red light made the scene look like a painting of a descent into hell. Elena began compressions, the rhythmic crunch of ribs, a sound she had learned to tune out years ago. 1, 2, 3, 4. She looked at the clock. They were 45 minutes into the night. The temperature in the ER had risen by 5 degrees. The smell of sweat and unwashed wounds was becoming thick, almost tasted on the tongue. Come on, she whispered, her eyes locked on the monitor. Don't you dare die in the dark. Just as a spark of hope flickered on the screen, a solitary, weak sinus rhythm, the heavy lead-lined doors to the ambulance bay were thrown open with such force they hit the wall with a deafening bang. A police officer, his uniform torn and covered in soot, stumbled in, carrying a child in his arms. You need to shut it down, the officer screamed, his voice cracking. The tanker. It wasn't just fuel. The hazmat sensors on our units are spiking. We've got a chemical plume heading straight for the intake vents. Elena froze. A power failure was a crisis. A mass casualty was a disaster. But a chemical contamination in a locked-down hospital was a death sentence for everyone inside. Here's the translation into polished U.S.-style narrative English, maintaining the technical medical vocabulary and the high-tension tone of the script. The air in Elena's lungs felt as if it had turned to lead. The word hazmat hung in the corridor like a death sentence. If Cook County's ventilation system sucked in chemical vapors, while the hospital was in code black, with doors sealed and air circulation crippled by emergency power, the ER would become an improvised gas chamber. She felt sweat trickle down the back of her neck, a cold trail amidst the stifling heat of the trauma bay. The smell of burnt rubber wafting through the ambulance bay doors suddenly seemed more acidic, more aggressive, stinging her nostrils with a metallic bite. Marcus, cut the external air intake now, Elena shouted, her eyes locked on the monitor for the patient in Bay 7. Immediate shift to internal recirculation protocol. Close the dampers on the south sector ventilation ducts. Doctor, if we do that, the temp is going to jump 10 degrees in minutes. The equipment will start redlining from overheating, Marcus warned, already sprinting toward the manual control panel. It's that or let everyone suffocate. Do it. Elena turned toward the officer carrying the child. His uniform was soaked in an oily, yellowish substance. Get back, nobody touches him. Silence fell over the nursing staff, a vacuum of fear. In a level 1 trauma center, contact is instinctive, but the sight of that yellow stain on the officer's chest was a biohazard red flag. The SOP for contamination was clear: immediate isolation, but the hospital was already in a state of collapse. Triage Level Red for decontamination, Elena commanded, pointing toward the isolation wing. Don't move without level C PPE. Marcus, I want the decon shower set up in the bay in 2 minutes. Nobody enters without being scrubbed. The pressure was now a physical force crushing Elena's shoulders. As the team scrambled to don yellow Tyvek suits, memories of Elena's past began to surface like wreckage in a rising tide. She saw the reflections of the red emergency lights and remembered another night, in another hospital, where hesitation had cost everything. The secret she kept, the reason she had left Boston under a cloud of silence, throbbed in her temple like a migraine. She couldn't hesitate again. Resilience wasn't just technical. It was an absolute refusal to surrender to panic. Dr. Vance, the vitals for the patient in Bay 7 are crashing again, an intern screamed. Intubate, now! Elena moved with the precision of a machine. She caught the scent of fresh latex and the heat radiating from the emergency lamps, which were now buzzing with a sharp, irritating hum. The cold touch of the laryngoscope in her hand contrasted with the patient's feverish skin. We have to stabilize as many as we can before the chemical plume hits the perimeter. Where is the incident command report? At that moment, the police and paramedic radios erupted into a deafening roar of static. A distorted voice cut through the chaos. Attention all units. The spill on the I-90 has been identified. It's ammonium nitrate and jet fuel. The fire is out of control. Repeat, the exclusion zone is expanding to 2 kilometers. Elena looked at the digital map on the wall, which was flickering with low power. The hospital was exactly 1.5 kilometers from the epicenter. They were inside the kill zone. We have 30 minutes before the air saturation hits critical levels outside, said Eris Thorne, approaching Elena. Her mentor looked as though he'd aged 10 years in the last hour. The red light carved deep shadows into his face. Elena, we have to evacuate the ambulatory patients. If we get sealed in here with 40 criticals and the filtration system fails, this becomes a morgue. Evacuate to where, Eris? The streets are gridlocked by the pileup and visibility is 0 because of the chemical smoke. She shot back, wiping blood from her face with her sleeve. We are the only operational level I in the sector. If we close, these people die on the sidewalk. The sound of shattering glass echoed from the end of the hallway. The weight of the external pressure was starting to crack the infrastructure. One of the reinforced windows in the waiting room buckled under the intense heat of the nearby fire, and the roar of the chaos outside. Distant explosions, screams, the constant growl of the flames invaded the hospital like a hungry monster. The smell of smoke became suddenly unbearable, a mix of melted plastic and death. Incident Command says the water purification system might be compromised, Marcus announced, returning with a pale face. The pressure in the internal hydrants is dropping. Elena felt the first sting of true defeat. No water, no full power, and a chemical cloud at the door. Cook County was no longer a hospital. It was a steel trap. She looked at the child the officer had brought in, now lying on an isolation gurney, small, terrified eyes fixed on her. Elena's resilience was being tested to the breaking point. She took a deep breath of the hot, fouled air and made a decision no manual could teach. Seal the air ducts with tape and plastic if you have to. We're converting the ER into a manual positive pressure bubble, she ordered, her eyes shining with fierce determination. If the world outside wants in, we're going to give it a fight. Nobody dies on my watch because of a logistics error. But as she spoke, a new and terrifying sound began to vibrate through the building's foundations. A deep rumble coming from the basement where the oxygen tanks and generators were housed. The earth shook, and the red lights cut out completely, leaving them in absolute silence and total darkness, where only the acrid scent of danger remained real. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a physical weight. For 10 seconds, the only sounds were the shallow, terrified breathing of the staff and the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of ventilators switching to internal battery reserve. Then the floor beneath Elena's boots shuddered again. A low, guttural groan of twisting metal echoed from the bowels of the hospital. The backup generators hadn't just flickered. They had been choked. Flashlights! Now! Elena barked, her voice a whip crack in the void. Small beams of LED light began to cut through the gloom as nurses pulled pen lights and tactical torches from their pockets. The ER looked like a shipwreck. The red emergency glow was gone, replaced by dancing, narrow white circles that illuminated patches of chaos. A blood-stained sheet here, a tray of discarded syringes there, the wide, unblinking eyes of a shock patient. Marcus, get to the basement, Elena ordered, moving toward the central station. The vibration came from the oxygen vault or the primary fuel line. If we lose the main O2 manifold, the wall ports go dead. We'll be bagging 40 people by hand in the dark. I'm on it, Doc, Marcus replied, his flashlight beam bouncing as he disappeared into the stairwell. The air was getting hotter. With the ventilation fans dead, the body heat of 100 people trapped in the sealed ER was becoming unbearable. The smell was a thick, suffocating cocktail of sweat, iodine, and that creeping, acidic chemical tang from the I-90 wreck. Elena felt a bead of perspiration sting her eye. She wiped it away with a gloved hand, her mind racing through the physics of their predicament. They were in a dead zone. No power, no external air, and a rising casualty count. "Dr. Vance," a young intern, Sarah, called out from Bay 12. "The patient from the bus, he's crashing. I think the chemical exposure is causing a flash pulmonary edema. His lungs are filling with fluid faster than I can suction." Elena navigated the dark hallway, her flashlight beam illuminating the desperate scene. The patient was a man in his 50s, his skin a sickly, mottled gray. He was drowning on dry land. Every breath was a wet, bubbly struggle. "We need a ventilator," Sarah cried, her voice climbing toward a break. "But the port isn't delivering pressure." Elena grabbed the oxygen mask, feeling the flow. It was a whisper. The manifold was failing. "He's not getting enough PEEP. Grab the BVM, bag valve mask. We're going to manual. Sarah, you have to stay in rhythm. Do not stop. If you stop, he dies." As Elena assisted with the intubation by the flickering light of 3 pen lights held by trembling nurses, a new sound began to vibrate through the walls. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of glass shattering, not from heat, but from impact. "They're breaking in!" a voice screamed from the waiting room. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Because of the code black lockdown, the main entrance was a fortress. But the triage lobby was packed with people who had fled the chemical plume outside. Panic had turned the crowd into a mob. They weren't patients anymore. They were desperate survivors trying to breach the only safe building left on the south side. "Security to the lobby!" Elena shouted into her radio, but only static answered. The interference from the chemical fire or the power surge had fried the internal comms. She looked at Sarah, who was rhythmically squeezing the blue resuscitation bag, her face pale. "Keep bagging, Sarah. Don't look at the door. Look at his chest." Elena stepped out into the hallway. The emergency doors at the end of the corridor were bulging. People were throwing themselves against the reinforced glass, their faces distorted by the light of her flashlight. They were screaming for help, for air, for a way out of the toxic fog. One man was using a heavy metal trash can as a battering ram. Crack. A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the glass. This was the war of command. Elena stood between her patients, who were helpless, tethered to failing machines, and a mob that would trample them in a blind search for safety. "Doctor? Thorne!" Elena saw her mentor appearing from the surgical side. "We need to barricade the inner trauma wing. If that glass breaks, the chemical fumes from their clothes and the outside air will contaminate the entire sterile field." "We can't just leave them out there to die, Elena," Thorne shouted back, the stress finally breaking his professional veneer. "There are children in that lobby. If we let them in without decontamination, we kill everyone in these beds." Elena stepped into his space, her eyes fierce. "That is the SOP, Eris. We protect the integrity of the ER first so we can save the many. If we collapse, there is no help for anyone." "You're being cold," Thorne hissed. "I'm being the chief resident of a level-wide trauma center in the middle of a disaster," she retorted. "Get the heavy equipment carts. Block the inner doors. Now!" As Thorne and 2 orderlies began dragging heavy metal supply cabinets to block the hallway, the first pane of the lobby glass gave way. The sound was like a gunshot. A wave of hot, acrid air rushed into the foyer, followed by the roar of the desperate crowd. Elena stood her ground, her flashlight beam fixed on the breach. She could see the yellow haze of the chemical plume swirling just outside the main doors, a ghost waiting to enter. She looked at the pressure gauge on the wall. The hospital's internal pressure was dropping. They were losing the bubble. Just then, Marcus's voice crackled over a battery-powered megaphone from the stairwell. "Dr. Vance, the basement is flooded. A water main burst near the generators. I can't get to the O2 valves, and the water is rising toward the electrical bus bars. If it hits the main switch, we're going to have an arc flash explosion that will take out the entire ground floor." Elena looked at the mob, then at the failing ventilators, then at the door leading to the basement. The counter in her head was ticking. Oxygen, 8 minutes. Power, 5 minutes. Integrity, 0. "I'm going down," Elena said, handing her flashlight to a nearby nurse. "You'll be trapped if the doors seal," Thorne yelled. "Then make sure you're still standing when I come back up," Elena replied, already running toward the dark, wet mouth of the basement stairs. The descent into the basement was like plunging into the throat of a dying beast. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water, wet concrete, and the sharp, terrifying scent of ionized air, the smell of electricity looking for a place to land. Elena's boots splashed into 4 inches of cold, dark water as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, reflecting off the rising tide that was slowly swallowing the hospital's nervous system. "Marcus!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the low, pipe-filled ceiling. "Over here, Doc! Don't come any closer to the primary switchgear." Marcus's voice came from behind a massive cluster of oxygen tanks. He was standing on a plastic equipment crate, his flashlight aimed at a wall of humming electrical cabinets. A bright blue spark danced across the surface of a bus bar, illuminating the dark water for a split second. The vibration Elena had felt upstairs was worse down here. A main water pipe had buckled under the pressure of the city's shifting grid, and a high-pressure jet was spraying directly onto the secondary cooling pumps. The water was now 6 inches deep and rising. If it touched the main electrical bus, the resulting arc flash would not only kill them, but send a surge through the ER that would fry every monitor and ventilator still running on backup. "I have to get to the O2 manifold," Elena said, wading forward. The water was freezing, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat of the ER upstairs. "If you step in that current when that breaker blows, you're done, Elena," Marcus warned, his voice tight. "The whole floor is a conductor. We have 40 people upstairs whose lungs are currently waiting for me to turn a valve, Marcus. I'm not leaving them." Elena moved with a focused, desperate grace. She climbed onto a metal catwalk, her heart hammering. Below her, the water swirled like a dark river. She reached the oxygen manifold, a series of heavy brass valves and gauges that controlled the lifeblood of the trauma center. The primary gauge was vibrating in the red zone. The pressure was spiking because the automated regulators had failed without power. If she didn't bleed the lines manually, the pipes upstairs would rupture. She grabbed the main wheel. It was ice cold and slick with condensation. She heaved, her muscles screaming, her breath hitching in the humid air. Nothing. It was jammed. "Come on!" she hissed, bracing her feet against the railing. "Not today." She thought of the young man in Bay 7, the child in the officer's arms, and the dozens of faces blurred by pain upstairs. She thought about why she had become a doctor, the resilience it took to stand in the gap when everything else fell apart. If you've ever had to be the calm one in the middle of a total crisis, comment, "I stayed calm." I want to know you're here with me in the dark. With a guttural cry of effort, Elena threw her entire weight into the turn. The valve groaned, a screech of metal on metal that sounded like a scream, and then it gave. A hiss of high-pressure oxygen filled the room as the pressure began to equalize. The vibration in the floor immediately began to subside. "The O2 is stable!" Marcus yelled, checking a remote gauge. "But the water! It's an inch away from the bus bar, Elena! Get out of there!" Suddenly, a massive crack echoed through the basement. The main breaker hadn't just tripped, it had exploded. A fireball of blue and orange light erupted from the electrical cabinet, reflecting off the water in a blinding display of lethality. Elena was thrown back against the oxygen tanks as the catwalk groaned. Total darkness returned. "Marcus?" Elena whispered, her ears ringing from the blast. A moment of terrifying silence followed, broken only by the sound of rushing water. Then, a faint light appeared. Marcus was still on his crate, his flashlight flickering. "I'm okay. But the primary power is gone. Gone for good. We're on the last line of battery reserves now." "How long?" Elena asked, climbing down the catwalk, her hands trembling. "Maybe 20 minutes. Then the ventilators stop. Then the monitors go dark. And the chemical plume is still outside those doors." Elena climbed back up the stairs, her clothes soaked and her spirit pushed to the absolute edge. When she burst back into the ER, she didn't find the relief she expected. The barricade Thorne had built was holding, but the air in the trauma wing was visibly hazy. The seal had been compromised. Dr. Thorne was standing over a patient, his face mask off, coughing violently. The invisible villain, the chemical fumes, had found a way in. "The vents," Thorne wheezed, pointing upward. "The manual dampers. They didn't close all the way. We're breathing it, Elena." Elena looked at her team. They were exhausted, wet, and now they were being poisoned by the very air they were trying to protect. She looked at the clock. 11:14 p.m. The night was barely half over. "Mask up!" Elena shouted, grabbing a surgical mask and dousing it in saline, a desperate old-school trick to filter particulates. "Everyone, saline-soaked masks now. We are moving to a localized clean room strategy. We huddle in the ICU core and seal the internal doors with surgical tape." She saw the fear in their eyes, the realization that they were retreating into a smaller and smaller circle of safety. But as she began to direct the movement of the gurneys, she saw a shadow through the fractured glass of the lobby. A man in a dark tactical jacket was standing there, watching her through the cracks. He wasn't a patient, he wasn't screaming. He was holding a radio, and he was looking at Elena with a cold, calculated interest that had nothing to do with needing help. The human villain had arrived, and he wasn't there to be saved. The man in the tactical jacket didn't move. He stood in the wreckage of the lobby, surrounded by the moaning crowd, a silent predator in the middle of a slaughterhouse. Behind him, through the shattered glass, the Chicago night was an apocalyptic orange. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She locked eyes with him for a heartbeat, before a surge of patients being pushed into the clean zone broke her line of sight. "Marcus, get the internal ICU doors prepped for a plastic seal," Elena yelled, forcing her focus back to the crisis at hand. "We are abandoning the main ER floor. It's contaminated." The false solution of the basement repair had bought them oxygen, but the air quality was plummeting. The saline-soaked masks were a stopgap, but the nurses were already showing signs of exposure: watery eyes, persistent coughing, and a lethargic heaviness in their movements. The heat was becoming a monster of its own, thick and smelling of unwashed bodies and chemical fire. "Move, move, move," Elena directed, her voice hoarse. The transition was a nightmare of logistics. Moving 40 critical patients, many still tethered to portable monitors and manual bags, into the smaller, more confined ICU core was like trying to fit a gallon of water into a pint glass. Gurneys collided in the narrow halls. The sound of shouting replaced the professional cadence of the hospital. As Elena pushed the final gurney, the young man from Bay 7, through the double doors, she felt a hand grab her arm. She spun around, expecting a panicked relative. Instead, she found the man in the tactical jacket. He had slipped through the barricade during the chaos of the move. "You're Dr. Vance," he said. His voice was calm, terrifyingly out of place. He wasn't coughing. He wore a high-grade, low-profile respirator that looked military. "I'm working. If you're not injured, get back to the lobby," Elena snapped, trying to shake his grip. "I'm not here for a checkup, Elena," he whispered, leaning in. "The tanker on the I-90? It wasn't an accident. And it wasn't just nitrogen. There's a canister of proprietary bioreagents in that wreckage that my employers need. It was being couriered on one of those buses. One of your red tags has it." Elena's blood turned to ice. The mass casualty wasn't just a disaster, it was a crime scene. "I don't care about your canister. I have people dying." "Listen closely," the man said, his grip tightening until it bruised. "The power grid didn't just fail, it was suppressed. And it stays down until I find what I'm looking for. You want the lights back on? You want the ventilators to keep humming? You find a silver Pelican case, roughly 10 inches long. It was with a passenger in seat 4A. "Get out!" Elena hissed, her eyes blazing. "Now, or I'll have security." "Security is busy holding back the mob I just led into the North Wing," he interrupted with a thin smile. "You have 10 minutes before the backup batteries on those vents hit zero. Tick-tock, doctor." He vanished back into the hazy shadows of the ER floor just as Thorne called out from the ICU core. "Elena, we're sealed, but the pressure is dropping. We need the main power, or these people are going to suffocate in this clean room." Elena stood in the threshold, the weight of the choice crushing her. The man was a human villain, riding the back of the invisible villain. If she found his case, she'd be aiding a criminal. If she didn't, 30 people would die when the batteries died. The resilience she had cultivated her whole life, the stay calm mantra, was being tested by a moral fire. She looked at the patient list. Seat 4A, Greyhound Bus 402. She scanned the tags in the cramped ICU. Found him, Bay 3, a man with massive internal trauma, unconscious, his clothes cut away and piled in a biohazard bag beneath his bed. Elena walked to the bag, her hands shaking. She reached into the pile of blood-soaked denim and nylon. Her fingers hit something hard, cold, metallic. She pulled it out, a silver case, heavy and sealed with a digital keypad. "Elena, what is that?" Thorne asked, approaching her, his face mask dripping with saline. "The price of the lights," she whispered. She looked at the case, then at the flickering monitors. The battery indicators were all flashing red. 5%, 4%. The silence of the room was becoming deafening. This was the worsening. The solution wasn't just a mechanical fix. It was a soul-deep gamble. Elena knew that if she handed this over, she might save the room, but she'd be letting a monster walk free. But if she stayed silent, she was the one killing them. "I need to make a call," Elena said, her voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "The phones are dead, Elena," Thorne shouted. "Not all of them," she said, remembering the satellite link in the incident command room, the one Sterling had been hiding in. She realized then that the revelation of her past, the reason she knew how to handle high-stakes trauma and the shadow of failure, was about to become her only weapon. She wasn't just a doctor. She was the daughter of a man who had taught her that in a siege, you don't play by the rules, you rewrite them. She tucked the case under her arm and headed for the reinforced door. "Where are you going?" Thorne cried. "To negotiate with the devil," Elena replied. "And Eris? If the lights don't come on in 3 minutes, start the manual bagging. Don't stop until I get back." The hook was set. As she stepped back into the contaminated, dark ER, she wasn't the prey anymore. She was the hunter. The air in the abandoned ER wing was a toxic soup. Elena's saline-soaked mask was already drying out, the harsh chemicals stinging her throat with every shallow breath. She clutched the silver pelican case to her chest, her silhouette cast in long, jagged shadows by the beam of her flashlight. The revelation she had kept buried for years pulsed in her mind like a dormant fever. 10 years ago in Boston, Elena wasn't just a resident. She was the daughter of General Silas Vance, the man who had authored the very mass casualty protocols the military used for chemical warfare. She had fled that life, the cold utilitarianism of her father's world, choosing the healing halls of Chicago over the war rooms of the Pentagon. But tonight, the healer was gone. The general's daughter had taken the wheel. She reached the incident command room. The heavy door was ajar. Inside, Sterling was slumped in a chair, unconscious from the fumes. Elena ignored him. She went straight to the satellite terminal, the only piece of tech in the building with an independent uplink. "I know you're listening," Elena said, her voice echoing in the small room. She didn't use the radio. She spoke to the shadows. "You didn't just suppress the grid. You're monitoring the hospital's internal sensors. You can hear me." A crackle came from the wall-mounted intercom. "You're 5 minutes late, doctor. The batteries in the ICU are at 2%. I can hear the ventilators slowing down from here." "The case is rigged," Elena lied, her voice as cold as a winter morning on the lakefront. "My father is Silas Vance. I grew up around bioreagents. If you try to take this case without the secondary stabilization code, the internal vials will shatter. You'll get your prize, but it'll be a puddle of useless glass and a localized lethality zone that will kill you in seconds." The silence on the other end was heavy. She had hit him with a truth he hadn't calculated. "What do you want?" the man in the tactical jacket hissed. "Power, now, all of it," Elena commanded. "I want the main grid bypassed and the emergency bus bars energized. I want the HVAC units on the roof to purge this building. And I want the security gates on the north wing locked. Do it, and I'll give you the code. I don't have the authority to—" "You have the technical means," Elena shouted, slamming the case onto the desk. "You're an operative, not a scavenger. Turn on the lights, or we all die in the dark, and your employers get nothing but a bill for a failed mission." For 30 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Elena watched the monitor of the satellite link. Then, a deep rhythmic thud vibrated through the floor. It was the sound of the massive industrial chillers on the roof groaning to life. Above her, the flickering fluorescent tubes hummed, buzzed, and then exploded into brilliant, blinding white light. The air vents began to roar. The stagnant, toxic haze was suddenly caught in a violent downdraft as the high-capacity scrubbers engaged. "Power is restored," the voice said, sounding closer now. "The code, Vance, now." Elena looked at the case. She didn't know the code. She never did. But she knew something else. She knew that the man in the tactical jacket had made one fatal mistake. He assumed she was playing the same game he was. She grabbed a heavy trauma shear from a nearby tray and jammed it into the case's seal, prying with a strength born of pure adrenaline. The lock snapped. She threw the lid open. Inside weren't vials of bioreagents. It was a thermal-stabilized organ transport unit. Inside, nestled in nutrient-rich slush, was a human heart. "It wasn't a weapon," Elena whispered, her eyes filling with tears of rage and relief. "It was a transplant." The passenger in seat 4A wasn't a courier. He was a medical transport tech. The mass casualty had nearly cost someone a second chance at life because of a corporate thief's greed. The door to the command room burst open. The man in the tactical jacket stood there, his respirator off, his face contorted in fury. He saw the heart. He saw the empty lie. "You've just killed 30 people for a piece of meat, doctor," he said, drawing a suppressed sidearm. "No," Elena said, standing tall as the sirens of the Chicago PD finally began to wail just outside the now-powered gates. "I just saved the only thing that matters." The lights in the hallway strobed. The battle for the ER had reached its turning point, but the war of command was about to get bloody. The suppressed pistol looked like a toy in the harsh, flickering light of the command center, but the cold vacuum in Elena's chest told her otherwise. The man in the tactical jacket stepped into the room, his boots crunching on the glass from the blown fluorescent tubes. The roar of the HVAC system was a deafening backdrop to the standoff. "You think you're a hero?" the man spat, his eyes darting to the silver case. "That heart belongs to a CEO who paid $10 million to skip the UNOS list. It wasn't medicine, Vance. It was a transaction, and you just voided the warranty. In this hospital, a heart is a heart, Elena replied, her hand hovering over the satellite terminal. And in 10 seconds, the Chicago PD's SWAT team is going to breach the North Wing. I triggered the silent alarm the moment the power came back on. The man's face hardened. He didn't look back. He was a professional. He knew he had a window, a small, violent window. He leveled the gun at her chest. Then I guess I'll just leave with the meat and leave a corpse behind to explain the mess. Elena, duck! The voice came from the doorway. Marcus appeared, swinging a heavy industrial fire extinguisher with the force of a man who had spent his life moving engine blocks. The heavy red cylinder caught the operative in the shoulder just as he pulled the trigger. The muffled thwip of the gunshot was followed by the sound of a bullet shattering the satellite monitor inches from Elena's head. The operative stumbled, his gun clattering to the floor. Before he could recover, Marcus was on him, pinning him against the wall with the sheer mass of his frame. Get the case to the OR. Marcus grunted, his face turning purple as he struggled to keep the man's hands away from a concealed knife. Go, Elena! The transplant team is trapped on the 4th floor. Elena didn't hesitate. This was the war plan. She grabbed the silver case, the weight of the cooling mechanism humming against her ribs. She sprinted out of the command center and into the hallway. The ER was a scene from a fever dream. Now that the lights were on, the true scale of the carnage was visible. Blood trailed across the white linoleum like abstract art. Nurses were still bagging patients, their faces etched with a fatigue so deep it looked like bone. But they were winning. The invisible villain, the fumes, was being sucked out by the vents, replaced by the sharp, cold Chicago air. Clear the path! Elena screamed, clutching the heart. She reached the elevator bank. Dead. The power surge had fried the lift controllers. She turned to the stairs, her lungs burning. Every flight felt like a mountain. On the 3rd floor landing, she tripped, her knee slamming into the concrete. She didn't feel the pain. She only felt the case. It was still humming. She burst through the 4th floor surgical doors. The hallway was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the war zone below. At the end of the hall, a team of surgeons stood behind a glass partition, looking like astronauts in their full sterile gear. I have it! Elena shouted, slamming the case onto the prep table. The lead surgeon, a woman Elena had known for years, looked at the case, then at Elena, drenched, covered in soot, and bleeding from her knee. Vance? We heard the hospital was under siege. We thought the courier was lost in the pileup. The courier is dead, Elena said, her voice cracking for the first time. But the heart is viable. Get it into the recipient, now. As the surgical team scrambled, moving with the rhythmic grace of a well-oiled machine, Elena collapsed against the wall. She watched through the window as they opened the case. The heart sat there, a symbol of everything they had fought for, a fragile, pulsing hope in the middle of a night defined by death. But the turning point wasn't over. Her radio, clipped to her belt, suddenly burst to life with Marcus's voice, and he sounded terrified. Elena, the North Wing, the mob didn't just break in. They brought the fire with them. The triage lobby is an inferno, and the oxygen lines we just fixed? They're right above the flames. If the fire reaches the manifold, the whole North Wing is going to level. Elena stood up, her legs shaking. The plan had a flaw. They had saved the heart, but they were about to lose the hospital. Marcus, where are the shutoffs? They're in the lobby, Elena, right in the middle of the fire. You can't get there. Nobody can. Elena looked at the surgical team. They were already beginning the transplant. If she didn't stop the fire, they'd be operating in a furnace. She didn't look for a hero. She looked for a way back into the fire. The air in the stairwell was no longer just hot. It was blistering. As Elena descended back toward the ground floor, she could feel the vibration of the fire's roar through the handrails. The climax had arrived, and it was a hungry orange beast. The North Wing lobby was a chimney, drawing the heat upward. If the fire touched the main oxygen manifold, the very one she had fought to stabilize in the basement, the hospital wouldn't just burn, it would detonate. When she burst through the final set of double doors, she was met by a wall of black smoke. The clean room strategy was failing because the fire was eating the oxygen faster than the scrubbers could replace it. Everyone out of the North Wing, move to the south parking deck, Elena screamed, her voice barely audible over the crackle of burning upholstery and the shrieking of fire alarms. She saw Dr. Thorne near the triage desk, using a wet lab coat to shield a patient's face as they wheeled the gurney toward the exit. Elena, it's too late. The ceiling is melting. The shut-off valves, Eris. If I don't hit the O2 cutoffs, the surgery on the 4th floor becomes a bomb. She didn't wait for his protest. She dove low under the thickest layer of smoke, where the air was marginally cooler. The smell was horrifying, a mix of melting plastic, chemical residue, and the scorched earth of the lobby. Her eyes stung so badly, she had to navigate by the memory of the floor plan. 10 paces to the security desk, 5 paces to the maintenance panel. She reached the panel. The metal was so hot it blistered her fingertips through her gloves. She didn't flinch. She used the hem of her lead-lined vest to grip the red lever. With a scream of exertion, she yanked it downward. The hiss of the oxygen lines cutting out sounded like a long, dying breath. The immediate danger of an explosion passed, but the villain's fall was not yet complete. As the oxygen died, the flames in the lobby began to choke, but Elena was trapped in the pocket of smoke. Her head spun. The exhaustion of the 10-hour siege was finally catching up to her. Through the haze, she saw a figure. It was the man in the tactical jacket. He was slumped against a pillar, his leg pinned by a fallen structural beam. The human villain was being consumed by the invisible villain he had helped unleash. He looked at Elena, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. "Help! Me!" he wheezed. Elena stood there for a heartbeat. The daughter of the general would have walked away, a tactical casualty. The doctor stayed. She grabbed a heavy iron IV pole and used it as a lever. With a groan of shifting debris, she moved the beam just enough for him to crawl free. She didn't say a word. She didn't offer a hand. She simply pointed toward the south exit. He scrambled away into the smoke, a broken shadow of the man who had threatened her life an hour ago. Elena turned back to the ER. The fire was receding as the sprinklers, powered by the restored grid, finally gained the upper hand. The turning point had passed. She walked back into the main trauma bay. The lights were steady now. The frantic shouting had settled into the quiet, rhythmic sounds of post-op care. She saw Marcus standing by the nurse's station, his face covered in soot, but his eyes were bright. "The heart, Elena," he whispered. "The surgical team just called down. It's beating. The recipient is stable." Elena leaned against the blood-stained counter, her body finally giving out. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cold metal. The smell of the ER was changing again. The smoke was clearing, and the scent of antiseptic was returning. The order was being restored. She looked at the clock. 4:12 a.m. The longest night of her life was almost over. She had walked into the fire, faced the devil, and held the line. As the first gray light of a Chicago dawn began to bleed through the smoke-stained windows, Elena Vance finally closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in the profound, crushing silence of resilience. The dawn that broke over Chicago was not the bright, golden hue of a postcard. It was a bruised purple and gray, filtered through the thinning haze of the I-90 chemical fire. Inside the Cook County ER, the high-intensity surgical lights were finally dimmed, replaced by the soft, natural light of morning. The catharsis had arrived, but it was a quiet one. There were no cheers, only the rhythmic clack-clack of mops against the linoleum and the low, exhausted murmurs of a night shift that had survived the impossible. Elena stood by the large windows of the ICU bridge, a paper cup of bitter, lukewarm coffee held between her bandaged hands. Below, in the ambulance bay, the fleet of sirens had finally gone silent. The 42 patients they had intake during the siege were now accounted for. 38 had survived the night. In the world of Level 1 trauma, amidst a mass casualty and a total grid collapse, that number was a miracle. Dr. Thorne walked up beside her, his lab coat gone, wearing a clean scrub top that looked 2 sizes too big for his weary frame. He didn't speak for a long time. He just looked out at the city as it began to wake up, oblivious to the fact that one of its pillars had almost crumbled in the dark. "I called your father," Thorne said quietly. Elena stiffened, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Eris, I told you I left that life behind." "I didn't call the general," Thorne corrected, turning to look at her with a soft, paternal pride. "I called Silas. I told him his daughter didn't just follow the SOP tonight. She wrote a new one. I told him you were the reason this building is still standing." Elena felt a lump form in her throat, a wave of emotional resilience finally breaking the dam of her professional composure. She thought of the silver case, the beating heart on the 4th floor, and the man she had pulled from the fire. She had been tested by the human villain and the invisible villain, and she had emerged not as a weapon of her father's design, but as a healer of her own making. Marcus approached them, his massive shoulders slumped with fatigue, but a rare smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "The day shift is here, Doc. You're officially off the clock." "Is the lobby clear?" Elena asked, her mind already drifting to the epilogue of the night's chaos. "Cleaned, secured, and ready for triage level green," Marcus nodded. "And the police found that tactical jacket guy 2 blocks away. He didn't get far with a busted leg. Turns out he's got a lot to say about who hired him." Elena nodded, taking a final sip of the coffee. The war of command was over. The hospital was no longer a fortress under siege. It was a sanctuary again. She walked through the ER one last time before heading to the locker room. She passed Bay 7, where the young man who had arrived without a pulse was now breathing steadily on a ventilator, his vitals a rhythmic, beautiful song on the monitor. She realized then that resilience wasn't about being unbreakable. It was about being broken and choosing to put yourself back together, over and over, until the light could shine through the cracks. She had started the night as a chief resident under pressure. She was leaving it as the soul of the hospital. As she stepped out into the cool Chicago morning, the air smelled of rain and distant lake water, the scent of a fresh start. She took a deep breath, her first easy breath in 12 hours, and began the long walk to her car. Behind her, the doors of the ER slid open for a new patient, the cycle of healing beginning anew. If this story of high-stakes resilience moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more cinematic medical dramas. Comment the heartbeats. If you made it to the end, I'd love to see who stayed for the whole shift.